Welcome. I'm Mark Thomas with Worcester County Library. The Big Read is a major initiative of the National Endowment for the Arts, and we're grateful to the National Endowment for the grant they awarded to the Somerset County Public Library System that makes our local Big Read series possible. We also appreciate the generous financial support of the Maryland State Arts Council, the Worcester County Arts Council, and the Eastern Shore Regional Library. Two people deserve special thanks for putting together a 2-month series in 2 different counties. Lisa Stant of the Worcester County Library and my colleague Jennifer Rank, who is the director of the Somerset County Public Library System and a proud graduate of Stephen Decatur High School. Speaking of the school system, we're grateful for the cooperation and enthusiasm of the Worcester County Public Schools, and we especially thank Stephen Decatur for hosting us this evening. I know you'll want to hear every single word that Tim says, so those of you who haven't done so already, this might be a really good time to put your cell phones on vibrate or silent. And at the end of the program, Mr. Brian will be out in the lobby and will be available to sign your books. The author of 8 books, Tim O'Brien received the National Book Award for Fiction in 1979 for his novel Going After Cacciata. In 2005, The Things They Carried was named by the New York Times as one of the 20 best books in the last quarter century. It received the Chicago Tribune Heartland Award in fiction and was a finalist for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Books Critics Circle Award. The title story from The Things They Carried received the National Magazine Award and was selected by John Updike for inclusion in the Best American Short Stories of the Century. In the Lake of the Woods, which is a book I highly recommend to you, published in 1994, was chosen by Time Magazine as the best novel of that year. And in 2010, Mr. O'Brien received the Catherine Ann Porter Award from the Academy of Arts and Letters for Distinguished Body of Work. So why do we read fiction? Sometimes for entertainment, sometimes to escape, sometimes because it was assigned. And sometimes we read so that by immersing ourselves in a made-up story, we can begin to learn something about ourselves, about life. In The Things They Carried, there is a recurring exploration of the relationship between objective facts and the truth. My favorite illustration of this tension goes like this. Once upon a time, a grandmother was reading a story to her granddaughter. And at the end, the little girl looked up and said, "Is this story true?" "Of course it's true," the grandmother said, "but it may not have happened." I am honored to present to you a masterful writer, a teller of stories, a seeker of truth, Mr. Tim O'Brien.
Great honor to be here tonight. I'm also a little terrified. This is a big room, and I worry that my voice is not going to fill this thing the way that music did. I could have just sat in that chair and listened to those songs for hours on end. Music has a way of bringing back memories that, in some ways, the written word just can't do. To listen to that music really, at times, even brought tears to my eyes. What I thought I'd do tonight is not lecture at you and try to do what I do best, which is to tell you a couple of stories in the hope that through the stories, my message, such as it is, will sink in. And I'm going to begin not in Vietnam, but in a little town in southern Minnesota that's reminiscent in a lot of ways of a lot of the towns I'm seeing here on the Eastern Shore. It was a small town called Worthington, in which I grew up and spent my years up and through high school. If you look in a dictionary under the word boring, you'll find a little drawing of my hometown Main Street to illustrate what that word means. On one side of Highway 16 coming into town was a huge field of soybeans, other side, big field of corn. If you like soybeans, you like corn, you're going to love Worthington. I've seen a few soybeans here, I might add. The place was as flat as the Eastern Shore. You could, without the trees you have here. Ours was just flat, going on for what seemed eternity. Well, what do you do if you're growing up as a kid in a town like this? There wasn't a lot for kids to do. I played a crappy shortstop for a Little League team, the REA, Rural Electric Association Little League team. I couldn't field, I couldn't hit, couldn't run, couldn't throw, otherwise I was a pretty good shortstop. And I remember a day in my childhood, as vividly as any days I recall from Vietnam, that turned me into a writer. I had gone through a particularly terrible baseball practice. It was middle of July, somewhere in the mid-50s. Striking out, booting ground balls, missing pop flies, the whole thing. It was bad. And I had had dreams up to that point of being a Major League Baseball player. I mean, I wanted it. I had a framed picture of Ted Williams in my bedroom right above my headboard. And I would look at that picture wanting to be Ted Williams. And I realized at the end of practice that day that this dream was not dormant, but dead. It was not going anywhere. And I can remember traipsing home, carrying my glove and a bat over my shoulder, feeling dejection that's really hard to describe to you. Now it's kind of funny, but back then it was not funny. It seemed to me as if my life at 9 years old was over and my dreams were kaput. I whipped by the Nobles County Library on the way walking home. It was one of these old Carnegie libraries that, you know, I think still dot our country, but back then were certainly in virtually every small town throughout the Midwest, my own included. And I went into this old Carnegie library, and the moment I stepped into this place, I felt what I always felt walking into a library, which was an immense physical reaction of peace and happiness. The smells of paper and books and glue and ink, and the smell of Johnson's paste wax on the floor, and the ceiling fans spinning in this old library. It wasn't the books so much that attracted me, although of course they did, but it was that immense sense of refuge this place had. Well, I went into the children's section that day, and feeling despair, really, and I found a book that, as much as any book I've ever read, made me into a writer. It was a kid's book, but it was really important to me. The book was called Larry of the Little League. Yeah, it was, I don't know, 40 pages long. It was a short book with illustrations filling up many of those 40 pages. I sat down, still with my, beaten up old uniform on and my baseball cap on, and wearing it tonight in honor of this story. And I read this book, and in the book, this kid Larry could do everything I couldn't do. The kid could hit, field, run, and throw, and he could do them all well. I read the book and went over to the librarian and asked for a piece of paper and a pencil. And she gave me a whole stack of paper and a pencil. And over the course of the next 45 minutes or an hour, I wrote what became the first novel of my life. It was this thing. It was short. It was 20 pages long or so. I thought of it as a novel, the title of which was Timmy of the Little League. It was a direct rip-off of Larry. Not just the title, but I would simply take the story, and wherever the word Larry appeared, I'd stick in the word Timmy throughout the whole story. And in this book, this kid Timmy could do everything I couldn't do in the world. The kid could, run and hit and field and throw. On page, 5 or 6 of the book, the Timmy character got the game-winning hit. in the Worthington Little League playoff. We beat the Kiwanis team, 6-5, something like that. On page 12 or so, the character Timmy, the whole team went up to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul, where we really beat up on a ritzy suburb called Edina. I mean, it's just full of rich kids, aristocrats, we thought. We beat them 40-0. I scored all 40 runs. I got all the hits. I would play shortstop and first base simultaneously. Catch the ball, throw it to first base, that's it. I was pitching, catching, I was doing everything. At the end of the book, on page 15 or 20, wherever it ended up, the Worthington, Minnesota Rural Electric Association Little League team went to Williamsport, Pennsylvania, where we beat Taiwan 300-0. We just stomped them. And again, I did it all. Well, why do I tell you this little anecdote? I tell you partly because it's true, it happened. My mom, until her death not too long ago, claimed she still had this book, or kind of use it as a threatening device, make me behave. She'd release it to the New York Times or something. I didn't shape up and do what she wanted. I went through her things and didn't find it, but much to my chagrin. I wish I did have a copy of this thing. That's one reason I mentioned it to you. A second reason I mentioned it to you is for the high school students here. That as important as Shakespeare is going to be to you, and Flaubert, and all the great writers in history, the books you encounter in childhood are just as important. Whatever makes you read, whatever enlivens your imagination, whatever makes you dream, whatever takes you out of the world you're in and puts you in another alternative world, however briefly, is worth the reading. It doesn't have to be the masterpiece at first. It can be Tom Sawyer, which is a masterpiece, but it could be the Hardy Boys too, most of which are not. In my case, Larry the Little League is a book that I will revere the day I die. It's right up there with a book called Timmy is a Big Boy Now, which I read when I was 5 or 6, my first book of my life. I took it very personally because of the title. It's a book about, Timmy can tie his shoes, and Timmy can go to school by himself. And I thought, how the hell does this author know all this stuff about me? I mean, how did he learn this stuff? And that I can tie my shoes. I took it very personally. That book matters to me. So in a way, I'm talking partly about libraries and supporting them. That's, that's under the auspices of the libraries that I'm here before you right now. But it's also an homage to my childhood and what first made me dream, however tentatively, about being a writer. The desire to be a writer did come out of childhood in large part. I have a memory, image in my head, again as strong as any image that still haunts me from Vietnam, of my dad sitting in the living room in an easy chair at the hour of dusk when it's almost completely dark outside, and in my memory there's a light on behind my dad's head, and he's reading a book. And in his face, in this memory, there is such rapture and happiness and delight in whatever he was reading. And I remember looking at my dad's face, wishing that I could be that book. So that my dad would look at me with that same love and happiness and content with which he was looking at the pages of that book. That memory, I think, probably even more than anything that came at me from Vietnam, resulted in my finally becoming a writer. In the end, my life did collide with Vietnam. That child I just told you about, that 9-year-old kid, grew up, went through high school, college, and ended up drafted to serve in the Army in 1968. I spent my basic training at Fort Lewis, Washington, and then I went to a thing called AIT, which means Advanced Individual Training, also at Fort Lewis. In my case, the Advanced Individual Training was in the infantry. They had made me into an infantryman. I was a guy who hated Cub Scouts. And I didn't like dirt and mosquitoes and bugs. I didn't know one end of a rifle from another. Never shot one in my life. Didn't want to. I didn't like hikes at all. I sure hated running. I already told you about Little League Baseball. I was the last guy you would think that a military organization would put out in the field as a grunt or as an infantryman. But that's the Army for you. Those of you who've been in the Army know what I'm talking about. They find the way to do the opposite of what ought to be done. They find it with regularity. They're really good at that. And they put me into the infantry. I became a writer, really, in Vietnam at the bottom of an irrigation ditch in the year 1969. It was July, a hot day in July. And my company was about 100 men. It was back then. I'm not sure what it is now, but it was then. We'd been pinned down by mortar fire, machine gun fire, rifle fire. And by pinned down, I mean the enemy was all around us. There was no front, there was no rear. It was just all around us. And there was a large rice paddy, probably twice the size of this auditorium. It was a big rice paddy, at one end of which was a long irrigation ditch that fed the paddy. And in that paddy there were leeches and algae and human excrement, animal waste. It was a stinky, smelly, god-awful place. And I and about 13 or 14 other guys that were pinned down in that irrigation ditch leading into the paddy. All around me there was gunfire, people screaming, people dying, both Vietnamese and Americans, as it turned out. And somewhere at the bottom of that ditch, as I whispered to myself, dear Jesus, let me live. 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 Over and over and over. And hearing similar mutterings coming from my fellow soldiers as we heard this screaming and people dying all around us. Somewhere at the bottom of that ditch, a resolution came into my head that if I made it through this nightmare, and not just the nightmare of that ditch, but the nightmare of Vietnam in general, I would somehow come home and bear witness. I would not stay silent. I would not keep my mouth shut, as I had prior to going to Vietnam. But I would spend the rest of my life, if I had to, talking about this war. At the time that I was pinned down in that irrigation ditch, I was not a writer, but I became one on the way out of that ditch. Somewhere between entering it and coming out, there was a resolve inside me. There was a resolve that people feel when they might come out of a bad marriage, or out of a concentration camp, or out of a love affair gone bad or sour. A resolve that from now on, I'm not going to be the silent citizen that I had been, but I'm going to bear witness. The things they carried was born in that ditch. The stories that, quite literally, some of the chapters in the book, especially those chapters I call the shitfield chapters, when the character of Kyle sinks into the waste, the human and animal waste of that field, is that those smells and that memory of that horror was born in that real life ditch that I myself emerged from. To talk about the things they carried is in one sense to talk about Vietnam, but I want to pause now, having talked for a while about war, and issue with a reminder that I don't view myself as a soldier. I didn't view myself as a soldier when I was a soldier, and I certainly don't now. I view myself as a guy who found himself in a war and pulling triggers, but I never thought of myself as a soldier. I thought of myself more as kind of an anti-soldier, if anything, enduring what seemed the unendurable. And when I came home from that war, I became not an ex-soldier or a vet, as many guys think of themselves, but I became a writer. And the things they carried, as much as it's about combat and about Vietnam, is equally about the power of stories in our lives to make us see and make us feel and make us hear in a way we didn't before. The story I just told you, I've told you two already. One about the Hilaria Little League little story, elicited laughter. It made you hear and feel and see something from many, many decades ago. And similarly, the story, I hope, of the irrigation ditch, in which my life as a writer began, made you see and hear and feel something too, that goes beyond what you'll see on a CNN or a Fox Channel report. 7 guys died today in Baghdad from an IED. And that's all you get. You get a number, maybe a date, and the facts of, but you get nothing in the way of experiential things, the sights and sounds. The next thing I want to do is a way of talking about the things they carry. I'm going to speak, by the way, for probably just another 20 minutes or so, or 15 minutes. And I'd like to spend, unlike last night, I spoke over, was it Easton, I think it was time, last night? And I talked too long, and there were such great questions coming from the audience, I felt there wasn't enough time for it. So I pledged to myself I would stop a little earlier tonight and reply to whatever you may have to say. The next thing, though, I want to do is I want to talk about a typical day and night in Vietnam. And I think probably a typical day and night, not just in Vietnam, but probably in Iraq and Afghanistan going on right now as you and I are sitting here in this beautiful auditorium. There are people in places right now that aren't quite as beautiful and comfortable and peaceful as this place is, and it's happening now. Around 5 o'clock in the morning or so, we would be awakened from an encampment, a perimeter, somewhere in the boonies of Vietnam. We never knew where we were physically. We had no idea. We were just essentially, except for our officers, totally lost. We had no idea the names of places, of rivers, of villages. We were just lost in the most sort of dreamlike, nightmarish sense of we didn't know up from down. We'd be awakened about 5. We'd cook our sea rations and eat, and then we'd just begin saddling up for the day, as we called it, which meant putting on our gear, a rucksack, bandoliers of ammunition, cleaning our weapons sometimes as best we could, which was almost impossible to get them really clean. They malfunctioned all the time. We put grab our claymores and we put those on. We'd hang our hand grenades from our vests, smoke grenades. By the time we were done putting all this stuff on, we'd put on anywhere between 75 and 85 pounds of stuff, more or less. Usually it was more, especially if you were carrying things like scrambler radios or mine detecting equipment. And then you'd be carrying over 100 pounds of stuff. And then your day would start. Trudging off toward the first objective of the day, which would usually be a little nameless village and again in the middle of nowhere. We go into the village, get there maybe at 7 in the morning, something like that. We'd search the place, frisk women, children, old men. There were never any, military-age males in these places, never. We'd sometimes beat on them, sometimes scream at them, UVC, UVC, where VC, where VC, which was, of course, utterly useless. They didn't speak English. They didn't speak Vietnamese. It meant nothing to them. All we did was scare the hell out of them. In that village, somebody might die, somebody might not. The deaths were almost all by landmines in these places. I'd say 80% of our casualties were through landmines, of which there were many varieties, everything from what we call toe poppers, they looked like little sardine cans that were filled with explosives, and you'd step on it and it would blow off some toes or a foot, up to things we call bouncing betties, which were about this big, and they were like canisters that were planted in the earth, and you'd step on them, they'd explode out of the ground, the first charge, they'd get waist high or so, and then they have a second charge, which would, blow your belly away. They were really, really lethal things. They killed a lot of my fellow soldiers. All the way up to booby-trapped artillery rounds, 105 and 155 rounds, which would basically blow up this auditorium and everything in it. There'd be some survivors, but it would kill a lot of you, almost all of you probably, if one hit dead center. And you can imagine if a platoon, say 30 guys, were to touch one of these off, most of them are dead and the others are missing arms and legs. That was our war. It was a war of village to village. And you go back to the first village that you'd gone to 3 days ago, and you do it again. Then a week later, you come back to the first village, and you do it again. Somebody might die, somebody might not die, and then you do it again. And then 2 weeks later, you do it again. And then 3 weeks later, you do it again in the same place, over and over, repetitively. My area of operations was in a province called Quang Ngai province that is mentioned in the things they carried. And I tried to describe it physically as best I could. When I arrived in Quang Ngai province as a newbie, just first day or two there, I learned that 75% of the dwellings in this province had already been obliterated. They were gone. That means houses and whatever was there. They were gone before I got there. Most of it. So it was wreckage. And over the course of my year tour there, the wreckage was sort of just made into more wreckage, sort of like stirring the stew. The wreckage got wrecked as we walked through this place. And there was very little left in the way of what we would look at here in the States as civilization. What do you do when you're 21, 22, 19, 20 years old and you're walking through a war like this? Well, a war in which you can't tell friend from enemy until they're shooting at you. Then you can tell. But until then, you have no idea whether that little 16-year-old girl over there is for you or against you, is planting mines or not. You have no idea until the shooting starts. What do you do when you can't distinguish friend from foe? And what do you do when landmines are killing you? How do you shoot back at a landmine? How do you kill it? It's dead. You can't kill it. And can you imagine the frustration and the anger that begins to well up in you as you watch your friends die and lose their arms and legs to things you can't shoot back at? It wasn't the John Wayne Green Beret scenario that I encountered in Vietnam, the song that was sung earlier tonight. There was no enemy that we could find. They'd find us with their mortars and their ambushes and so on and their landmines, but we never found them. They would always find us, except for one exception in my experience over there that ended in disaster. The death of my best friend, a kid named Chip Merricks from Orlando, Florida. That was our one success, with my best friend dying. So you can imagine what the failures were like to that war. After a day, I'm trying to do a typical day and night now, but after a day of this, village to village to village, with no sense of destination, no sense of mission. In World War II, the stories I heard from my dad were, we're heading for Tokyo, or we're heading for Berlin in the European theater. We were going somewhere. But my war, the war of the Vietnam veterans in this audience, was a war of going largely in circles, and then returning to the point of origin, and then coming back again. It was a scrambled, mixed-up war, and a war without a sense of geographical destination. We're heading somewhere. And all along the way, casualty after casualty after casualty, not just on our side, but of course on the Vietnamese side as well. It was a war full of ambiguity of what's right and what's wrong, and who's right and who's wrong. I had gone to Vietnam a disbeliever from the start. It seemed to me that the best you could say about the war was that certain blood was being shed for uncertain reasons, which is to say that bodies were for sure, they were dead, and the widows were for sure, they were widows. And the orphans were for sure. They were orphans. Nobody disputed it. That was for sure. But on the other side of the equation, the reasons for the war were really uncertain. It was a time, for those of you who lived through that era, who know as well as I do, of a country divided right down the middle. It was alluded to in a lot of the music we heard tonight. Eve of Destruction against Ballad of the Green Berets, one written in response to the other. My own family was divided. My mom was for the war, my dad was against it. There was divisions in the halls of Congress and the streets of America. The whole country was divided about the rectitude of that war. And it seemed to me, as a 21-year-old kid entering the Army, that you don't go off killing people unless you're pretty sure it's the right thing to do. Unless there's some sort of consensus. You don't do it unless you're pretty sure. And our country was not pretty sure. It was divided. And that's the attitude I took with me to Vietnam, a skeptic from the beginning. And my skepticism just got validated by every step I took through that godforsaken war. I came home not a skeptic anymore, but a cynic. A war of ambiguity. And I wanted to just read one short passage from the things they carried that's about the very subject I'm talking about. It's a war in which it was hard to tell right from wrong. I was brought up a Methodist, kind of a fundamentalist Methodist in my small town in southern Minnesota. And we were taught, thou shalt not kill. And the preacher said, as far as I can recall, there were no exceptions. It didn't say, except when your country tells you to. Does it say that in the Bible? I don't believe it does. And if you're a literalist or a fundamentalist, as I kind of was brought up, it struck me in Vietnam as a little strange to arrive and have my company commander tell me, you'd better kill, or we'll court-martial your ass. Well, who's right and who's wrong? Is your country right? Is the preacher right? They can't both be right because they're saying utterly contradictory things. That's just one little example of how a kid from Worthington, Minnesota, bearing with me to the war all the values that I think I probably shared with you guys, all the people in this audience in small town America, and finding things turned upside down. Not just religion, in terms of religion, but in terms of who I was as a human being, the things I was asked to do, that seemed to me immoral. And all done in the name, of course, of great morality. How do you generalize? War is hell. But that's not the half of it. Because war is also mystery, and terror, and adventure, and courage, and discovery, and holiness, and pity, and despair, and longing, and love. War is nasty. War is fun. War is drudgery. War is thrilling. War makes you a man. War makes you dead. The truths are contradictory. It can be argued, for example, that war is grotesque. But in truth, war is also beauty. For all its horror, you cannot help but gape at the awful majesty of combat. You stare out at tracer rounds unwinding through the dark like brilliant red ribbons. You crouch in ambush as a cool, impassive moon rises over the nighttime paddies. You admire the fluid symmetries of troops on the move, the harmonies of sound and shape and proportion, the great sheets of metal fire streaming down from a gunship, the illumination rounds, the white phosphorus, the purply orange glow of napalm, the rocket's red glare. It's not pretty exactly. It's astonishing. It fills the eye. It commands you. You hate it, yes, but your eyes do not. Like a killer forest fire, like cancer under a microscope, any battle or bombing raid or artillery barrage has the aesthetic purity of absolute moral indifference, a powerful, implacable beauty. And a true war story will tell the truth about this, although the truth is ugly. To generalize about war is like generalizing about peace. Almost everything is true. Almost nothing is true. At its core, war is just another name for death. And yet any soldier will tell you, if he tells the truth, that proximity to death brings with it a corresponding proximity to life. After a firefight, there is always the immense pleasure of aliveness. The trees are alive, the grass, the soil, everything. All around you, things are purely living, and you among them. And the aliveness makes you tremble. You feel an intense, out-of-the-skin awareness of your living self, your truest self, the human being you want to be, and then become by the force of wanting it. In the midst of evil, you want to be a good man. You want decency. You want justice, and concord, and courtesy. Things you never knew you wanted. There's a kind of largeness to it, a kind of godliness. Though it's odd, you are never more alive than when you're almost dead. You recognize what's valuable. Freshly, as if for the first time, you love what is best in yourself and in the world, all that might be lost. At the hour of dusk, you sit at your foxhole and look out on a wide river turning pinkish red, and at the mountains beyond. And although in the morning you know you must cross the mountains, cross the river, do terrible things, and maybe die, even so, you find yourself studying the fine colors on the river. You feel wonder and awe at the setting of the sun, and you are filled with a hard, aching love for how the world could be, and should be, but now is not. In war, you lose your sense of the definite, hence your sense of truth itself. There's no clarity, everything swirls. The old rules are no longer binding, the old truths are no longer true. Right spills over into wrong, order blends into chaos, love into hate, ugliness into beauty, law into anarchy, civility into savagery. The vapors of war suck you in. You are blinded. You cannot see. And the only certainty is absolute, overwhelming ambiguity. Therefore, it's safe to say that in a true war story, nothing is ever absolutely true. That's as best as I can approximate the feeling of that ambiguity that overwhelms soldiers, I think, not just in the war I went through, but soldiers throughout history, from the Civil War to the Battle of Hastings to the Trojan Wars, an overwhelming cloud of ambiguity about oneself and the world we all live in, mixed with an appreciation for that world that we're living in that you never felt before, because with each step, you're almost dead. I want to now, in the remaining 5 minutes or so, go to a place I haven't been yet in this little talk. Did I learn anything from it all? Well, in a practical sense, no. I didn't come home with lessons that I could get on a pulpit and preach to you about. On the other hand, I learned things that are unpreachable, but still learned. For example, I learned that courage is not just does not just have a physical aspect, say charging bunkers or getting up under fire. But there's also a moral dimension to it that is probably harder to achieve than physical courage, at least it was for me. I was able, more or less, to do the physical stuff. I was able to advance under fire, and I was able to, as we said in Vietnam, just keep humping, which meant you just walk. When you have landmines all around you, you can't believe what it's like to make your legs move, because every corpuscle in your body says stop. Just drop, not another step. And yet, my legs kept moving, and so did the legs of the fellow soldiers, my fellow soldiers in Vietnam. Harder was the moral stuff, to stand up against evil and to say no. One of my big regrets that I've talked about a lot since I arrived here on the Eastern Shore, but I want to say it again because it's a regret and something that jerks me awake at night, is the memory of a lieutenant whose nickname was Mad Mark, tying an 85-year-old old man to a tree, wearing these kind of short black peasant shorts, and beating on this old man's shins with a branch over and over, just bam, bam, bam. And every now and then he'd say, UVC, where the VC, UVC, where the VC. This guy's 85 years old. I'm sure he doesn't, speak a word of English. He has no idea what's being asked of him. Where VC, he doesn't know what the word where means. He probably doesn't write Vietnamese. Probably never been to school a day in his life. Well, my memory is not just of this war crime. My memory, what jerks me awake isn't that. What jerks me awake is my own silence as I watched it happen and didn't say stop it. I didn't say no. I didn't say this is illegal or this is evil or this is a sin, what you are doing. I stayed quiet for the same reasons I stayed quiet prior to going to the war. Fear of embarrassment, fear of ridicule, fear of censor, fear of my buddies not respecting me, fear of being called a sissy or a coward or whatever the words might be. I stayed quiet. And I regretted it ever since. You know now something of why that irrigation ditch pledge was made that I was not going to stay silent anymore. I made it out of the ditch and made it out of that war. I was going to testify and bear witness to that which I had seen and done. Another lesson I learned is this, and this is a tough one. It may not go down well here, but it's a lesson learned of this sort. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Our view of a person, of an act, may not be shared by others in this world. They may be looked at in an opposite way. And I lived that in Vietnam with the Viet Cong. I'm a red-blooded American and love my country, but I came to learn that there are red-blooded Vietnamese who love their countries, as George Patton once told us. And it was a lesson hard won. I learned that a bullet can kill the enemy, but I also learned that a bullet can manufacture an enemy. That bullet hits a 3-year-old kid in the eyes and kills that kid. You got one ticked off mommy, don't you? And daddy, and brother, and sister, cousin, and uncle, and neighbor, and friend. Just multiply it out. That family may have been indifferent to the war, may have even been friendly, but when that bullet strikes a child in the head, you've made enemies. It has nothing to do with global politics, terrorism, Marxism, whatever. It has to do with what you would feel if a bullet hit your child in the head. That's what it has to do with. It has to do with humanity. In the end, we tend to think of war so much as politics and having to do with political causation and so on. But on the ground, war is lived. It's a human experience. And there are human responses to that experience. And it's a lesson that I took home with me. The last thing I want to mention is, as a kind of a lesson, and I'm going to stop and take your questions, is that, again, the hard way, but a lesson well worth bearing with me. Among the things I guess I carry, and probably will carry with me to the grave, is a sense of a feeling of outrage at hypocrisy of all sorts. The hypocrisy, for example, of those who issue their bellicose, belligerent rhetoric in behalf of a war from the safety of their TV studios, wearing their nice little bow ties and their Van Heusen shirts, their suits and so on, and they're not there, and with their kids tucked away safely at Harvard or Yale or the University of Chicago or University of Maryland or wherever. We used to talk about this in Vietnam virtually every night, partly laughing, but it was gallows laughter. It was angry kind of laughter. And one guy would say to another, if they're so for this war, why don't they get their asses over here? If you're so for a war, put your blood where your mouth is, or your daughter's blood, or your beautiful little boy's blood, and not somebody else's. What kind of support for a war is that when you say, yeah, well, let's all go to war, but you do it. I'm not going, and my kids aren't either. What kind of support is that for a war? Well, I'll tell you the kind. It's hypocritical support. It's not real. It's undermined by hypocrisy. And boy, in Vietnam, did that tick us off. And I think you can hear in my voice now, as I conclude this talk, that ticked off feeling hasn't entirely evaporated. It still remains with me. I suppose of all the human flaws and sins around us, the one that really still gets my goat really comes down to that sense of hypocrisy, asking others to do the bidding of your rhetoric. I'm going to stop now. I feel like I've tried to talk kind of around the things they carry to give you some of the information, not information, but the background that I would want to hear if I were going to hear an author. I've intentionally avoided, except for that brief reading I did from the book, speaking directly about the book. And I did it for what I think are good reasons. The main one being you can read the book. And you don't need me to read it to you or to paraphrase it. I spent a lot of time writing that book and a lot of work put into it, years of my life, 6 in fact. And I don't want to paraphrase all those hard-won words that I battled over for hour after hour, minute after minute. You can read them. But I did think it was important that when an author comes to a place to give you a sense of what goes into a book and the way of human passion, and have you meet the Tim O'Brien that wrote that book, and not just the character within the book. So thank you for your indulgence and your listening, and now it's time for me to do what I like by far the best, which is to respond to whatever questions you might have. Thank you. If anybody has a question, there's one right away. Thank God. I love that.
You spoke at Salisbury University several years ago, and thanks for both, for being here now and for being there then.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate it when my kids quote me back to them, but I'm going to quote you back to yourself, because it's a line I use on my kids. You said then, everybody will tell you write what you know.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to tell you write what you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something you still...
I still do believe it. That common saw of write what you know. The problem with that old saying is that what we know changes. What I knew about the world before I went to Vietnam was not what I knew about the world after. And what I knew about love was not what I knew before I met my wife. And we could just go on through life. It changes. Human beings, unlike the other animals in our world, we have a capacity to go beyond ourselves into what we don't know. Lewis Carroll did it, for example, in Alice in Wonderland. I mean, who can know that which doesn't exist? That is playing croquet with geese and the Queen of Spades or Hearts chasing after you and Mad Hatters. I mean, You can't know that stuff. We can imagine it. Or the way Kurt Vonnegut imagined in his great novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, life on another planet, which is a fantasy of a lot of ex-soldiers, just leaving what we call it the world, this civilization, going back to the world, and you come back to it, and part of you just wants to leave the world in general. And Vonnegut did beautifully with that. I've used that in my own writing time after time, where I don't write about what happened. I usually write about what almost happened, or what could have happened, and in many cases, what should have happened. I could have walked away from the war in Vietnam, and probably I should have, given my own beliefs. What's to stop me? It can't be any more dangerous walking to Paris or Vietnam than it was in Vietnam. And I've got a weapon and rations, and we soldiers would daydream about it all the time. We tell jokes about it, you know. There's that line of mountains. We're walking anyway, so let's just straighten out the march and head up over those mountains and into Laos and just start walking to Paris. You know, many of the great war novels that we all have read are about this very theme. Catch-22 with Orr, rowing for Sweden. Or, Farewell to Arms, rowing across the lake, heading for peace. And my own Going After Cacciata was a story about heading for Paris. Red Badge of Courage, running from a war. That idea of flight. Anyone in their right mind, as Heller told us, at some point, you think, man, this is ungood. This is evil. I want out of here. You're going to think it unless you're crazy. Then you'd probably... then you could love it. And there were some crazy people, at least in my world. But if you have even a droplet of sanity, you're going to want out of it and out of the nightmare. It doesn't mean you do it, but you want it. I still believe that the human imagination is an incredibly powerful faculty that we don't have to just write about what we go through or what happened or what we know. An example I used recently here was my dad died not too long back, and in his final hours and final days in the hospital, I could have and I should have taken my dad in my arms and said, "Dad, I love you." I didn't do it for reasons of man and son stuff. We don't talk about the unspeakable love and so on. But in a story, my dad can sit up from the dead. In a story, he can reach out, he can take me in his arms, and he can say, "That's okay. I know you love me." Never happened. I don't know it in the sense of knowing reality. It's a figment of my imagination. But it made me, right before you, feel truly much more than I felt when I began the story of my dad, and I didn't say "I love you." But when I got to the part that's totally made up, my dad's says, "That's okay. I know you love me." It's embedded, but it does something to my heart. And that's what fiction is ultimately for. It's not for holding a mirror up to the world we live in, although it's partly that. But it's also the engagement of the mirror with human imagination and human dreaming and human emotions. That's what I meant by that statement. Yes?
After you wrote the things they carried, how did your peers that you served with respond to that story?
After I wrote the things they carried, how did my fellow soldiers respond? I don't know. But I didn't know then. I kind of know now. I was out of touch with these guys. As happens, you don't come back as a unit. You just leave separately from Vietnam. And I lost track of almost everybody. I did see my company commander at one point and a couple other guys doing things like this. They'd come to events just like this in small towns, and ran into one guy in Richmond who I'd served with. Another guy in New York City that I served with, and another guy out in Las Vegas that was living there. I gave a talk out there. But over the last 2 years or so, one of my fellow vets was in my company with me. A guy whose first name I didn't even know. I slept with him by the foxhole, and he was a buddy. We called him Buddy Wolf was his name. I didn't know his first name. And I learned later it's Robert. He got together with a bunch of other guys and started doing email stuff. They clang around in hyperspace, and one guy would contact another. And after a time, maybe 200 or 300 people who had served in my battalion were now in contact, sharing pictures and stories. And I finally responded and got involved and learned through them what the book had meant to them. How do you describe it? I mean, it validated stuff for them that you leave a war and it feels a little bit like leaving a dream. Was it real? And did I really go through that? Did that stuff really happen? And there's also a lot of mystery to your own war because you only see what you're looking at. You don't see what's happening around that hedgerow and over there and what's happening behind you. And so you start getting pieces of the story coming together for all these guys as we're all talking to one another, and your own knowledge about what had occurred and what other people have done and gone through on the same event is enlarged. The things they carried for these guys, man, it just sort of validated that what they'd gone through wasn't a dream, it was real, and somebody more or less remembered it as they had gone through it. More important than the reactions of my fellow soldiers have been the reactions of the children and the grandchildren of the guys in Vietnam by far. The typical letter is, "Dear Mr. O'Brien, I've been meaning to write you for a long time, and now I'm going to do it. My dad was a vet, dead silent, wouldn't talk about the war. I could feel tension all the time if the subject came up. It was verboten, couldn't talk about it and wouldn't. And one day in AP English, I read your book, and I brought it home, and my dad read it, my mom read it, and the conversation started. And now, they're not perfect. I'm summarizing a whole bunch of letters, like probably 1,000. But they all fall into this general kind of framework. And the world has not been repaired. It's not, it's only marginally better, but it's a little better. Because people are talking, and fathers are either able to open up to their daughters and their sons and to their wives. Oddly enough, I'm getting exactly that reaction now from the wives and the children of our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. That book is toted around over there. It's sent home to the children and say, I can't talk about this war. Read this one, and it'll tell you pretty much what I'm going through. And what an honor. What else can you say? What an honor. Maybe one more question. You tell that I've been talking for 4 days on the Eastern Shore. You guys are going to want me on an airplane tomorrow. But maybe one more. Yes, ma'am.
I just love the book. I want to thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Thomas, for arranging all this. There's two things that really touched me was the story of when you went to the northern part of Minnesota and you almost went across.
Yes.
That, I listened to this, I think we're probably the same age, and I felt it very strongly. The other part that I was really torn with, I didn't understand, was the woman being involved there.
Okay. That's a
Was
good
that
place
real?
to end.
I mean,
Yeah.
it just.
That's a great place to end. Let me talk about both those things. I'll talk about the first one briefly, because I've talked about it so much while I've been here. But the story of On the Rainy River, where the recent college graduate bearing my name, Tim O'Brien, says, I'm not going to Nam. And he's living in Minnesota, and he drives 8 hours north to the Rainy River, which, if you look in a book, you'll see separates Minnesota from Canada. It's a real river. And more like a lake, really. It's wide. It looks like a big, wide lake, but it's a river. It never happened. I didn't do it. I didn't drive to the Rainy River. None of the events in that story occurred. They're all made up. However, it's truer than the truth. If I were to tell you the truth of what happened to me that summer that I was drafted, I would tell you I played golf and I worried. And it would be true, because it is true, but you're just staring at me. Because it's boring. It doesn't mean anything. And I could tell you the truth of my pars and bogeys. If I could find the scorecards, I could read them out to you. It would be true, but you'd still say 5, 4, 6, 3, 200, whatever the numbers are. And you just stare at me. And it'll all be true. The story's made up, and it's meant to be a representation of what was happening inside me that summer. How much conflict I felt about loving my country and wanting to do the right thing by my small town that I told you about, Worthington, and to be loved and respected by the people in that town, the way any small town kid does, coming into conflict with my own conscience, which said you shouldn't be doing this. And through that whole summer of 1968, as I said last night, there were these two heads on my shoulders yakking at each other. One head saying, go to the war, do your duty, your dad did it, your country wants it, your hometown wants it. And then the other head saying, yeah, but you think it's wrong, it's not the right thing to do. What if my country told me to go invade Toronto tomorrow? Do I just do it? Is that what patriotism is? Go kill Canadians because my country says to do it? Is that what we mean by patriotism? That we just erase our conscience? We all become robots? Is that what we mean by it? And the other head could say, but your country wouldn't ask you to do such a thing. Don't be ridiculous. And on through the whole summer, these two heads debating with each other, much as the country was. So the story, although it's a great example of what I mentioned earlier to the other question, which, it didn't happen. I'm not writing what I know in a literal sense, but I'm writing what I know emotionally and about what I felt I'd gone through the summer of '68 as a 21-year-old kid, trying to make his mind up. Where should I put my body? Should I put it in the war? Should I put it in Winnipeg or wherever? So that's made up. The story of the woman who ends up in Vietnam strikes almost everybody as a total fable and impossible. Well, it's one of the few things in the book that's real, which is its own irony. And I feel such frustration whenever I talk about it, because I'm put in the position of trying to convince you that it's real. But I'm going to try. The same way in the story that Rat Kiley tried. I mean, he gets so frustrated. Nobody believes him, even his own company. How hard is it to buy a plane ticket in Cleveland and fly to LA? Anybody can do it, even if you're an 18-year-old girl. How hard is it to buy a plane ticket in LA and fly to Bangkok? Anybody can do it, provided you're 18-year-old. How hard is it when you get to Bangkok, is it to buy another ticket and fly to Saigon? No restrictions. Hippies going through that place, I mean, there were none. Nobody would stop you.